In the early hours of January 1st, a senseless crime left a community in shock. A teenager, barely out of childhood, allegedly took the life of a man who was simply trying to earn a living. This tragic event unfolded in Lawrenceville, Georgia, in a way that many would never have imagined, especially not from someone so young. What could possibly drive a 15-year-old boy to murder a complete stranger in cold blood? A life was lost, and another one was shattered forever. On January 1st, 2026, the quiet streets of Lawrenceville were rocked by a crime that seemed almost impossible to fathom. The victim was 58-year-old, insert Uber driver's name, a hard-working man who drove for Uber, trying to make an honest living to support his family. He was a father, a husband, and a respected member of his community. Just another person who, like so many others, got behind the wheel each day to provide for his loved ones. But on this particular night, he would not return home. As the clock struck the early hours of New Year's Day, he was allegedly shot by a 15-year-old boy, a teenager too young to even fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. The teenager, who had been riding in the victim's car, reportedly shot the driver and left him to die on the side of the road, fleeing the scene in what appeared to be a random act of violence. Authorities quickly identified the suspect, a boy who had already caught the attention of law enforcement for his erratic behavior. The boy, just 15 years old, was later charged with murder and is being tried as an adult, given the brutal nature of the crime. This case left everyone asking the same question: why? What could possibly drive someone so young to commit such a horrific act? As we dive deeper into the details of this tragic crime, we'll try to unravel the story of the victim and the suspect. But before we do, take a moment to subscribe to Real Crime Saga and hit the notification bell so you never miss an in-depth look at the most shocking real crime stories. Now, let's get into the heart of this tragedy. 58-year-old Cesar Tejada was not just a man behind the wheel of an Uber. He was a father, a husband, and a hardworking member of his community. By all accounts, he led a life dedicated to providing for his family, making sacrifices so that his loved ones could have a better future. His job as an Uber driver was not glamorous, but it allowed him to support his family, and he took pride in that. The long hours on the road were simply a means to an end, to make sure his children had what they needed, to ensure his spouse was comfortable, and to make sure his family didn't go without. He was the kind of person who found fulfillment in small, everyday moments. His family spoke of him as a reliable, loving father, always putting their needs above his own. He was known in his neighborhood as a friendly and approachable man, someone who would strike up a conversation with a stranger just as easily as with a longtime friend. His death left a huge void, not only in his family, but in the larger community that had relied on his steady presence. Neighbors, fellow drivers, and even the passengers he had helped along the way were devastated by the senselessness of his death. For his family, this tragedy is impossible to comprehend. The night he was killed, he was simply doing his job, like any other day. No one could have predicted that an ordinary Uber ride would turn into a fight for his life. His wife, his children, and his community were left reeling. In the wake of his death, many have reflected on the irony of how quickly life can change from the mundane to the tragic, and how the brutal death of a hard-working man will affect a family for generations to come. No amount of justice will bring him back, but for those who loved him, finding closure is an agonizing, ongoing process. On the other side of this tragedy is the teenager accused of committing such a violent act. At 15 years old, Christian Simmons is not even old enough to legally drive a car. Yet on the night of the shooting, he had the nerve to pull the trigger on a man who had no connection to him. But who was this teen, and what led him to commit such a horrific act? The suspect, whose name has been widely reported, was a local teenager from a nearby neighborhood in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Not much was known about him before this crime. He was just another face in the crowd, living a life that many would consider to be relatively normal for someone his age. But behind the schoolyard and street corners, there were signs that something wasn't right. According to neighbors and those who had crossed paths with him, the boy had a history of rebellious behavior. Reports suggest he had been in and out of trouble, known to authorities for minor offenses, but nothing that would have suggested he was capable of such an extreme act of violence. His parents, though they were shocked by the crime, expressed their heartbreak over what had happened. Some have questioned whether his upbringing played a role, citing possible instability at home or influences from the environment he grew up in. Was there something in his life, a lack of parental guidance, exposure to violence, or perhaps untreated mental health issues, that contributed to his behavior? These questions remain largely unanswered, as his past continues to be investigated. What made this even more troubling is the complete lack of remorse shown by the suspect. Reports from the police suggest that after the shooting, he showed no signs of panic or fear. He simply fled the scene, as though he had committed an act no different than a theft or a prank. His cold, calculated response to the crime has only added to the disbelief that a 15-year-old could commit such an act. So what went wrong? How does a young teen find himself in a situation where murder seems like the only option? In the coming sections, we'll explore this deeply, attempting to understand the psyche behind a crime that left so many searching for answers. It was the early morning hours of January 1st, 2026, a time when most people in Lawrenceville, Georgia, were either sleeping off the celebrations of the night before or preparing for a new day. But for Cesar Tejada, the new year began like any other. As an Uber driver, his day, or night, had to start early, typically around 4:30 or 5 a.m. to catch the early rush of passengers. For him, it was a regular routine, getting into his car, logging into the Uber app, and waiting for a ride request to come through. The early morning hours were often quiet, but business for Uber drivers never fully slowed down. Whether it was someone heading to work early, a traveler catching a flight, or simply people starting their day, there was always someone in need of a ride. The routine was simple for Tejada: pick up the passenger, drive them to their destination, and collect the fare. A modest, almost predictable job. Little did he know, that morning would not be like any other. It would mark the end of his life. At around 5:20 a.m., Tejada received a ride request. The ride would be the last one he would ever take. His passenger was Christian Simmons, a 15-year-old boy, who was likely just trying to get somewhere, though no one could have anticipated the violence that would follow. As Tejada pulled up to meet Simmons at the agreed-upon pickup point, nothing about the situation seemed unusual. It was an ordinary early morning ride, something that drivers like Tejada experienced countless times before. Simmons got into the car, and Tejada began driving. The car was quiet, the city still waking up, and the roads were relatively empty. As the minutes passed, something shifted. The teen, who had been quiet when he first got in, suddenly did something no one could have expected. Without any provocation or warning, Simmons pulled out a gun and aimed it at Tejada. What happened next is unclear, as there were no witnesses inside the car, but police reports suggest that Simmons shot Tejada at point-blank range. The details are chilling: a young boy, barely a teenager, carrying out such a violent act, seemingly without any motive other than a chilling desire to kill. The question everyone asked was, why? Why would a 15-year-old, who had just climbed into the backseat of an Uber, decide that his best course of action was to end a man's life? For Tejada, there was no warning, no conflict, nothing to indicate that a tragedy was about to unfold in that quiet vehicle on a regular morning. The shot rang out, and in an instant, Tejada's life was extinguished. According to police reports, Simmons then did something that shocked everyone involved. He calmly exited the vehicle and walked away from the scene, leaving Tejada's body behind. The teen didn't flee in a panic or act like someone caught up in the heat of the moment. His actions were cold, calculated. He simply left Tejada there, lying motionless in the car. There was no attempt to cover his tracks, no signs of a struggle, and no urgency to escape. As the minutes passed, police received a call about a man lying in the street on Groveland Parkway, and soon, officers arrived at the scene. They discovered Tejada slumped in the driver's seat, his body still inside the car. The police quickly realized that this wasn't an accidental death, it was murder. The authorities began to piece together the details of the crime, and it didn't take long for them to identify the suspect, thanks to the vehicle's tracking system, which had recorded all the relevant details of the ride, including the passenger's identity. Within hours, Simmons was taken into custody. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Cesar Tejada. What stunned everyone most was the fact that a 15-year-old was capable of such a brutal, senseless act. Simmons was cold in his actions, and his lack of remorse or panic only added to the disturbing nature of the crime. It seemed as though he had no regard for the value of life. Someone simply trying to make a living, a person who meant the world to his family, had been taken in an instant. As the investigation continued, authorities struggled to make sense of it all. The young suspect, barely old enough to understand the consequences of his actions, had taken the life of a man who was simply trying to provide for his family. There were no answers to explain why this happened, but one thing was certain. A community was left in shock, and a family was left without the man they loved. As the police arrived at the scene of the crime, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary case. The victim, Cesar Tejada, had been shot at close range while driving his Uber, leaving investigators to face a cold and senseless murder. But what made the investigation even more urgent was the fact that the suspect, 15-year-old Christian Simmons, had left the scene without making any effort to flee or hide. His actions immediately suggested that he wasn't simply a scared teenager who acted in a moment of panic. The lack of remorse and the calmness with which he left the scene pointed to a deeper, more unsettling mindset. Fortunately for investigators, there was one key piece of evidence that would make tracking down Simmons easier: the ride-sharing app's data. Uber's GPS tracking system had recorded the exact route Tejada took with Simmons in the car, and more importantly, it captured detailed information about the passenger who had entered the ride. The police were able to access this information quickly, identifying Christian Simmons as the individual who had requested the ride. The app also provided the exact time the ride began and ended, which narrowed down the time frame for the crime. The investigators wasted no time and quickly moved to Simmons' last known location. They began questioning people who might have seen him that morning or heard anything unusual. As the investigation unfolded, it was discovered that Simmons had a history of minor infractions, but nothing that would have immediately pointed to a violent crime of this magnitude. His background raised more questions than answers, and authorities struggled to understand what had led to this act of brutality. It didn't take long for the police to track Simmons down. The teen had been spotted in the vicinity of Lilburn, a neighboring town, and a few hours after the murder, he was found and taken into custody without incident. He had gone home after the killing, trying to carry on with his life as though nothing had happened. When the police arrived, he didn't try to run. He didn't act surprised. There was no remorse, no panic, just a calm teenager who had apparently given little thought to the enormity of the crime he had committed. Once in custody, Simmons was interrogated. Police reports state that during questioning, he offered no clear motive for the murder. There were no signs of a dispute between him and Tejada before the shooting, no apparent personal connection, just a seemingly random, senseless act of violence. Once Simmons was arrested, the gravity of his crime became clear to both the police and the public. Christian Simmons, who was 15 at the time, was charged with first-degree murder. The nature of the crime, cold-blooded, premeditated, and unprovoked, led authorities to treat the case with the utmost seriousness. Because of the brutality and severity of the crime, Simmons was charged as an adult, despite his young age. The decision to try Simmons as an adult shocked many, but it was justified by the nature of the murder. The fact that Simmons had premeditated the crime, gotten into the car without any clear motive, and then killed an innocent man without warning or remorse, made him eligible for adult charges. His actions were considered to be beyond the scope of what might be expected of someone his age, as he showed no signs of panic or regret after carrying out the shooting. For the victim's family, the decision to charge Simmons as an adult brought some sense of justice, although it did little to ease the pain of their loss. They were forced to face the brutal reality that a young boy, barely old enough to drive, had taken their loved one's life, and now they had to navigate the complicated legal process of seeking justice. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about youth violence, mental health, and the responsibility of parents, schools, and society to prevent such senseless acts from happening. For the community in Lawrenceville, it was a wake-up call. They never imagined that a teenager from their neighborhood could be responsible for such a violent crime. Simmons' trial, as it unfolds, will likely serve as a test case for how the justice system handles violent crimes committed by minors. The outcome will likely have broader implications, setting a precedent for how young offenders are tried and punished in future cases of extreme violence. The brutal murder of Cesar Tejada left his family shattered, struggling to comprehend the loss of a beloved father, husband, and friend. His wife, who had shared years of marriage and countless memories with him, found herself alone in a way that words could hardly capture. The weight of grief for her was unbearable, not just because she had lost her partner, but because their family was now left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been violently torn apart. For his children, the loss was even more incomprehensible. They had lost their father in the most brutal way imaginable, a father who had always been there for them, guiding them through life's challenges, big and small. Tejada's children, particularly, found it hard to reconcile their memories of a loving father with the cold reality of his death. The image of him leaving for work that morning, just like any other day, clashed violently with the image of his lifeless body in the car. The sense of finality, that their father would never return, became a heavy burden they now had to carry. The Tejada family has expressed their deep sorrow, but also their desire for justice. In interviews, they spoke of the void his death has left in their lives, how the family dynamic has been upended, and how each day since the murder has felt like an insurmountable struggle. His wife has shared that she often finds herself questioning why this had to happen. How could someone, especially a young boy, take the life of a man who only wanted to support his family? Despite their grief, the Tejada family has shown remarkable strength in their pursuit of justice. They know that no amount of punishment can bring their father back, but they hope that the trial and the subsequent legal proceedings will serve as a reminder of how one violent act can destroy not just one life, but an entire family's future. Their focus, however, has been on remembering Cesar for the kind, loving man he was, a man who spent his days working to build a future for his loved ones, and who should never have had that future cut short. The impact of Cesar Tejada's death rippled out beyond his family and into the broader Lawrenceville community, where he was well known and liked. News of the murder spread quickly, and soon after, the community rallied around the Tejada family. The crime shocked those who had known Cesar, the kind of man who was a constant fixture in the local scene, the guy you could always count on to lend a hand or offer a friendly word. His sudden and violent death struck the community deeply, with many grappling with the sense that their neighborhood, once peaceful and safe, had been violated in a way they hadn't anticipated. In the wake of the murder, there was an outpouring of support for the Tejada family. People came together to offer condolences, donations, and anything they could to help ease the burden on the grieving family. Local businesses, friends, and strangers alike joined in to show their sympathy, creating a bond that helped the family feel supported during an unimaginably painful time. Yet, despite this outpouring of support, the community also wrestled with a lingering fear. Lawrenceville was no longer just a place of quiet suburban life. It had become a place where a random act of violence could tear apart the fabric of their everyday existence. Public outrage over the crime was palpable. Neighbors expressed disbelief that a young teenager could commit such an extreme act of violence. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. People in Lawrenceville were now forced to confront the reality that no one was immune to crime, no matter how peaceful the area may have seemed. Parents in the neighborhood became concerned about the safety of their own children, wondering what might be happening with today's youth. How could a 15-year-old boy end up in a situation where murder seemed like the only option? Some members of the community spoke out about the breakdown of family structures and the lack of mental health resources for young people. Others debated whether society's failure to intervene earlier in the lives of troubled youth had contributed to the tragedy. The community was split, with some calling for more programs to help troubled teens, while others were simply angry, calling for justice to be served swiftly and decisively. Despite the anger and grief, the Tejada family found solace in knowing that they were not alone in their mourning. The support they received from their neighbors, friends, and even strangers was a reminder that, despite the horror of what had happened, there were still people who cared, people who wanted to see justice done for the man they had lost. For the Tejada family, though, the true healing will take time. They will carry the scars of this tragedy forever, but they can take comfort in the love and support they've received from the community. In the months and years to come, it will be the memories of Cesar and the kindness of those around them that will help them navigate a world forever changed by violence. The tragic murder of Cesar Tejada at the hands of Christian Simmons, a 15-year-old boy, raises more questions than answers. How could a young teen, barely on the edge of adulthood, commit such a violent, senseless act? What could have driven him to shoot a man who, by all accounts, did nothing to provoke him? These questions linger in the minds of everyone who hears this story, and perhaps they will never be fully answered. Was this murder the result of a broken system? The signs of Simmons' troubled past seem to suggest as much. Growing up in an environment that may have lacked the stability and support he needed, it's possible that Simmons never learned how to cope with his emotions, frustrations, or feelings of alienation in a healthy way. His actions might be the consequence of an upbringing marked by neglect, a lack of guidance, or exposure to violence. Could his family, his school, or his community have done more to intervene before it was too late? The fact that Simmons had already shown signs of rebellious behavior and minor criminal offenses suggests that he might have been falling through the cracks long before the fateful morning when he killed Tejada. But it's also possible that this tragedy is a reflection of a deeper issue, one that affects not just one family, but society as a whole. In today's world, where mental health issues are often ignored or misunderstood, Simmons may have been struggling with unseen emotional or psychological problems. Without the proper resources or support, young people like him can slip into violent behavior, sometimes with devastating consequences. The truth may never be fully understood, but the fact remains that a life was taken in an inexplicable and cruel manner. Then there's the question of the role of society. Did this tragedy happen because we failed to address the needs of troubled youth? Were there opportunities to prevent this, but they were missed, overlooked, or ignored? The failure to address deeper issues, mental health, social isolation, and the lack of meaningful intervention in the lives of vulnerable teenagers may have played a significant role in this senseless act. In the end, Cesar Tejada's death isn't just a statistic. It's a painful reminder of how one tragic decision can ripple out and change many lives forever. It forces us to reflect on the systems, the families, and the communities that play a role in shaping a young person's future. And it leaves us wondering, how many other young people are out there, struggling with their own demons, waiting for the right intervention before they, too, make a tragic choice? What could have prevented this tragedy? Could a different course of action have saved both lives, one from being taken and one from being ruined? These are the questions that will echo long after the trial ends, long after the headlines fade. In the end, Cesar Tejada's family will never get their loved one back, and Christian Simmons will live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. But perhaps this story can serve as a painful lesson for all of us, a reminder that the cost of ignoring the needs of troubled youth, the cost of not intervening when we see the signs, is far too high. As we reflect on this case, we must ask ourselves, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? The answers may not be easy, but the conversation must continue, because if we don't talk about it, we risk more tragedies like this one.